I'm David Merritt.
And I'm Francine Lacqua.
And this is In the City, Bloomberg's podcast connecting you to the conversations at the heart of the City of London.
And this week, Dave, we talk London tech.
That's right. It is London Tech Week. And we have both been down there at Westminster. I was there on day one. I think you've just got back.
I just got back day two. So on the first day, when you were there, you had the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Queues around the block.
I heard it was quite difficult, actually, to
it was
get
a bit
in
of a nightmare
so
getting in,
people.
actually. We managed to, our producer managed to sort of slip me a badge.
Bump
And
people
I
out of
actually had to queue barge. They were having to hand out water because it was so hot. So it was slightly chaotic in there. But a big crowd to Rishi Sunak. And then I met with the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, afterwards as well. And also part of the event's kickoff was the announcement of HSBC relaunching the recently acquired UK arm of SVB, which has now rebranded itself as HSBC Innovation Banking. And later in this episode, you'll hear my conversation with the group's boss, Erin Platts.
Yeah, and then the next day, they had the opposition leader, Keir Starmer. He laid out, I think for one of the first times, actually, his vision for a Labour government on how they deal with AI, how they regulate, and how they incentivize tech companies to list here.
There's going to have to be an overarching regulatory framework of some sort. The government's talking about principles in legislation which then find themselves in each of the sectors. I think we're going to have something stronger than that. I think foundation AI needs regulation as well, and that requires international leadership as well as leadership here, but also working with businesses, because you need a government that's on the pitch working with business to say, if there are to be changes in jobs, let's say, there are job losses, what are we going to do about the workforce?
Yeah, and of course you gave a proper grilling on stage, Francine.
We could have had more policy.
Yeah.
But actually his overarching theme was definitely, look, let's treat tech like an industrial plan.
Yeah, and listening to Sunak, he was clearly making the case that London is this kind of buzzing capital for tech. We're going to try and sort of peel back the layers of reality on that. So we've got in the room with us now, in the podcast studio with us now, we have our fintech reporter, Aisha Gani. Aisha, you've also been at Tech Week this week. What is your impression? Is all that hype for real?
Well, it's also worth mentioning that at the same time as UK Tech Week, we've also have Viva Tech in Paris.
Right, at the same time?
Well, at the same time, and they've flown...
They didn't mention that, did they?
They've flown in Elon Musk.
Oh.
We've got the CEO of Salesforce. Meanwhile, we're having a lot of policy discussions here. So I think you can see the kind of contrast.
And so Musk decided to go to Paris, not London.
Was he invited, though, to London? This is the question. Is it just it feels like a bigger event in Paris because they've been doing it for quite some time. And I think London Tech Week started 3 or 4 years ago.
They said that next year they're going to move to Olympia, much bigger. There's going to be lots more. We were trying to organise some of the interviews and it was just chaotic getting up and down into the floors. There was no space for the cameras. It's clearly completely outgrown that space. So it's going to be bigger and better next year. But we're kind of playing catch up with the French, right?
Yeah, I'd love to see the lineup next year. And we have other similar conferences. I went to IFGS, Innovate Finance's Global Summit earlier this year. And the headline speaker again was the economic secretary. He basically was telling founders that we are a sovereign nation. We dealt with SVB UK, get on with it, which I thought was quite intriguing. So it's definitely a lot more policy focused.
But Aisha, so if you look at the UK, are they trying to get more funding than France? Again, France has a lot of billionaires in telecoms that have put a lot of weight behind it. Or is the UK trying to regulate AI and really become a tech hub to rival Silicon Valley?
I don't think anyone could deny that the UK has slipped behind, and there are competing hubs and there are other exciting places. It's changed from the last few years. So it's about, I think a lot of it is about confidence as well. Everyone I speak to mentions political instability. They're kind of seeing where the chips will fall. So they're kind of holding on at the moment. We've seen really high profile CEOs and founders talking about their frustration with the UK at the moment. The Revolut founders being the ones that come to mind, saying how the red tape has been so frustrating, dealing with months and months of delays with regards to their emails regarding their UK banking license. So that kind of gives the flavour of the sort of things that they're having to deal with at a granular level.
So one of the things that the Prime Minister said was that Britain's biggest problem is less the kind of capacity of this economy to create tech companies, but more just the confidence to sort of celebrate it.
The government can do all these things, but fundamentally it requires the entrepreneurs to just keep going, to be not content with building the £100 million business and then the £1 billion business, but just to keep growing. And that I found in California is very much the attitude. It's just the sky is the limit. Everyone thinks they can create a $100 billion company, and actually, changing that culture is tough for government to do. But I don't know what you think about that.
Do you agree with that? Is it just about sort of the swagger or the ambition?
Oh, that has so much to do with it. I recently caught up with Tom Blomfield, who was a co-founder of Monzo, one of UK's unicorns. And he's now moved to sunny California as a partner at Y Combinator, the accelerator. And this is exactly the point he made. He's on the streets of San Francisco and he's seeing driverless cars, and people's startups are totally AI driven. And he said, like, the comparison 10 years ago in London was that it was really difficult for him as a founder to raise any money.
Yeah, and it was interesting, isn't it? I was sat there listening to the Prime Minister talk and about Britain as this hub, and his focus on cutting regulation and making it easier for people to come in on visas. And the reality of what we hear from executives is very different. And then this political instability question, because of course, when he took questions from the media, what came up? Well, it was the weekend of headlines about Boris Johnson and the honours list and that controversy. And that was what made the news from the summit, was his response. And now, the supposed war of words with Johnson. So yet again, he goes down the kind of rabbit hole of politics rather than actually pushing forward with policy. And you can sort of sense the frustration from the companies present. They want to hear about what we're doing to kind of promote business rather than getting sucked into the Tory psychodrama that we've been in the last few years.
Also, I look at it, I kind of put myself in a founder's shoes. And if you're just starting out right now, you need to be hiring the top talent. You need to secure the R&D tax credit. You need to deal with licensing. How do you get that through when the regulator's dealing with a backlog? Those are the kind of questions that founders are raising. And some of these founders, they are obsessed with looking at these headlines and trade deals, for example, and they thought maybe there'll be like a little bit of hope there. Just
to make things easier with the EU.
Exactly.
Just to kind of...
Because they were saying for months and months, well, for years, it seems as though we can't even speak about Brexit.
And one of the big problems is, obviously, as everyone said, about visas. And, we've heard Sunak saying that the system is perfect, but the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, when he spoke to me, said there's still a lot of work to do to ensure that we can attract the right sort of talent.
We can't be complacent. And what we've got to recognise is, yes, it's wonderful some of the world's best companies choose London as their European headquarters. They expand in London. But we've got to recognise on our doorstep is a market of more than 500 million people, the European Union. Even the Prime Minister recognises you can't turn your back on the European Union. So I welcome the fact that the Prime Minister is here today, the Chancellor is here today. So the good news to those watching this from overseas is you've got a government that understands some of these issues. The only problem is the Prime Minister is too weak to take them on and address them.
But Aisha, I think is the concern that first there's a skill shortage. So if you're a founder, you don't necessarily know if you find the right people to come in and fulfill the jobs that you need them to. And then second, because the Tories are doing so badly in the polls, are they just wanting to know more about what Labour government would look like? And we're still thin on details. I don't know whether because the election is still like 16, 17 months away, or because they haven't really put a framework on it yet.
I think it's both, but their immediate concern is we can't hire the best talent. What are we meant to do? How are we even meant to progress as a company? One founder I spoke to, he was really frustrated and he said the government needs to wake up. He's spent upwards of like 10K trying to hire top engineers from Europe and wait. No, exactly. And has already been waiting 9 months.
This has come up so many times, I said. And I mean, and again, keep going back to this sort of dissonance between the reality and what Sunak said on stage. He said, we've got this fantastic visa system now to bring in talent.
Whether it's the new scale-up visa that I introduced as Chancellor for companies who are scaling up to be able to get the talent they need, whether it's our innovator founder visa, which is globally extremely competitive, or the high potential individual visa that I created, which essentially says if you graduated from a global top 50 university, just come to the UK. You don't need a job offer. We just want to make sure that you can speak English and that you have a certain amount of money to support yourself. But otherwise, we just want you here because we think it will be additive to our economy. That's a massive we're open for business sign to the world's most talented. And I think that's important.
No one seems to have heard of that as well. So no one knows about these schemes. And the ones that are in place seem to be not fit for purpose, at least in terms of what the founders need and want. And yet the Prime Minister doesn't agree.
Exactly. I'm going to get a bit nerdy here, but of course, we know that the government pulled back their funding of Tech Nation, which dealt with a lot of these global tech visas. And then we had a bit of stalemate because we didn't know who would be responsible in issuing these tech visas anymore. So that happened earlier this year.
So Aisha, what is your outlook for London's tech scene?
I mean, London is not dead. That's key. And I do think we need to just be a bit more measured. And I think some of it is a bit scaremongering. But at the same time, we have to recognize that it is just becoming more difficult and there's real competition. When you have people like Macron literally rolling out the red carpet for founders to be at the Elysee Palace, and then you've got these founders who have photos with him and they go to US investors. And then on the other side, when US investors come to the UK and ask founders, well, how are you going to grow? Where are you going to expand? What's your passporting like? Have you got a foot in Europe? And they can't really respond. Then obviously there are challenges. There are real bureaucratic challenges that I think it totally depends on where you are in the ecosystem.
But does that matter? We're going to regulate AI worldwide. The UK is.
That's the big pitch at the moment, right? That Britain's going to take some role. And, saying this with the DeepMind guy there, who reports say actually is spending increasing amounts of time in the United States, right, rather than here. But putting that aside, can Britain really be a leader, kind of marshalling all of the different arms races that are going on AI around the world? It feels like that's stretching credibility.
We're already playing catch up, though. Europe and the US have been having these conversations for a while. They've already joined up in terms of research with regards to AI and the public good. They've already been discussing at meetings. I mean, the UK wants to host this global summit when? In the autumn? And it's a bit late.
Aisha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dave, the other question is, of course, how do you get funding? So you need a strong bank that will lend to some of these startups. And you had a great conversation with the newly minted chief executive of the former SVB UK.
That's right. Erin Platts used to run SVB UK. And remember, after the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, that unit was bought by HSBC for £1, was rescued. She is now the CEO of the newly minted HSBC Innovation Banking. And they announced the new name for that unit at Tech Week yesterday. She stood up and asked the first question to Rishi Sunak. She came into Bloomberg and we sat down and talked. And I think the question, do you remember when we did the podcast around the collapse of SVB, we talked about what it would mean for the startup scene in the UK? Would that kind of ecosystem collapse? Would HSBC even be able to replicate that kind of culture? Because it comes from a very different sort of place that SVB did. We're very delighted to have Erin Platts, the chief executive of the newly minted HSBC Innovation Banking UK. Welcome to the podcast, Erin.
Thanks so much for having me.
Can we believe the hype of London Tech Week?
Yeah, so I've been here now for over a decade and a half working with innovation businesses. So tech companies, life sciences, whether that be early stage startups, late stage public and private corporates. And it is astonishing to see how far we've come in the last decade and a half. And I do think that we are at a really pivotal moment. The market, of course, is a lot different than it was in 2021 and 2022. There is some, I would say, systemic changes happening. Raising money is harder. The public markets remain closed. Inflation remains sticky. So there's a lot to contend with. But if you take a step back and you look at the foundations that the UK has in terms of innovation, I'm really optimistic, right? We've got great universities. We've got fantastic talent. We've got largely friendly regulation. We're closer than we've ever been to unlocking pension capital. I think we're a hub, right, still for the US to come in. And Andreessen Horowitz's announcement that their first international office is in London is a big, big deal. So if you put all of that together, yes, the macroeconomic situation remains difficult. The innovation economy backdrop is challenging in pockets, but for me, the next 5 to 10 years will be hugely exciting.
When SVB was bought, SVB UK was bought by HSBC, one of the questions we asked, in fact, we talked about it on this podcast back at the time, was, will there be some sort of cultural loss there? SVB was kind of funky, right? People talked about the parties. It was a bit of a badge of honor if you were a founder to have an SVB account. Do you think HSBC Innovation Banking is going to step into that place easily that was vacated by SVB and be the bank of choice for startups in Britain?
Taking a step back, so what's changed and what hasn't changed? And I think that's a really important perspective to keep front of mind. So our name has changed. And actually, we spent a huge amount of time with the community, speaking to entrepreneurs at every stage, speaking to investors, and not just in the UK, but in the US, in Israel, and on the continent, to make sure that this new brand name would resonate. And what we found is actually the client base was really very happy to have HSBC feature front and center. It's been a tremendous 3 months in the banking sector, and HSBC has always been a stalwart of strength, right? Plus, then the innovation component we need to retain. And again, what hasn't changed? Well, we're really fortunate that our whole entire SVB UK team has remained together, continuing to service our clients in the same way as before.
You've got those relationships with all the
continuity,
with the founders.
Consistency in market. So they're working with the same people, same mobile phone numbers, right? So that feels really, really familiar. But then I think the trick is, and what we're working really hard to do, is how do we keep what was great about SVB UK and then bring together what's great about HSBC, the breadth of the platform, the sophistication of the products, the global reach. So we need to continue to work really, really hard to make sure that we're showing up externally in the same way. But the feedback, will be led by the feedback from our clients. And it's been great. We've seen more demand actually in the last 90 days than I expected.
Yeah, it was certainly, there was as I said, a real buzz in the room there. I just want to sort of sense check there a little bit more as well. You talk to a lot of these founders, and one of the things is the relationships you've got with everybody. Publicly, a lot of the more prominent founders and entrepreneurs have been pretty critical about the state of the market in Britain. For many reasons, companies and startups don't want to list their shares in London, and increasingly looking overseas. I mean, is the hype that we saw yesterday, is it for real? Or really has Britain got some structural problems that are making it harder for people to found and grow businesses here?
When I take a step back and I think about the UK, right, we are still the third largest innovation economy in the world. FinTech continues to be world-class, world-leading here and in London. There's a lot to be proud of. And there's a lot to do to continue to make this a top innovation destination and hopefully continue to climb the ranks. You are absolutely right. The reforms needed to make the London Stock Exchange competitive with the US markets. We are on that journey and we're not remotely done. And I know Julia Hoggett is a huge proponent of trying to drive change and really listen to entrepreneurs and investors to figure out what do we need to do to make the London Stock Exchange.
There's multiple parts of that, aren't there? Both on the regulatory front, there's things on you mentioned pension funds, unlocking capital.
Liquidity, there's culture, there's media, there's, a ton to unpick. And I think with that, it's, are we going to see the London Stock Exchange be as competitive with the US markets in the next 12 months? Probably not.
No. Let's be realistic.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. No. Yeah. Should we continue to aspire and drive change over the next 3 to 5 years? Absolutely. I'm really thoughtful as an ecosystem. Let's not perpetuate historic, perhaps, challenges. Mm-hmm. We often hear, the ambition here isn't as big as the US. I do not buy into that at all.
Do you think we're just sort of talking ourselves down a bit?
Yeah,
it's a British
trait. We are creating global category leaders in almost every single subsector. Let's celebrate that. I'm not saying it's perfect, but there is a lot to be proud of.
What's the toughest challenge for these startups? Is it interest rates? Is it raising capital? Is it getting the talent to come or to find the talent around the world? What's the biggest hurdle to success?
I think there's kind of top 3 challenges that, regardless of the year, they switch ranking, but it's always access to capital access to talent, and access to customers, usually on an international basis. And again, this year, access to capital has really stayed number one. As venture capital and private equity funds there's still a lot of price discovery going on. As LPs are looking at their allocations in this asset class, I think fundraising is going to continue to be difficult for the next probably 12 months plus. That's not to say that money is not flowing. That's not to say that incredible companies aren't raising money, but it's tough. It's tough out there. So I think that's still number one. Access to talent is always an issue. And there's a really interesting discussions thinking about the skills and talent that we need to foster here to be relevant for the next 5 to 10 years as the types of companies that are being started and scaled here is evolving.
Just looking at the rest of Europe, you've got staff here in the UK and in the Nordic region.
Yes.
Not currently in continental Europe. Is that going to change? I mean, we're obsessed on this podcast about the rise of Paris, for instance, as a financial rival to London, and post-Brexit, how financial services are being distributed around the rest of the EU. And you can say the same for some tech investment as well, right? I mean, are you looking at places like Paris or Berlin?
Yeah. So, Noel Quinn, the group CEO, has been really clear. He wants to take this business and brand global. The ambition is where there are pockets of innovation, capital, and talent, we really want to be serving our clients there, right? Wherever there's pull into these ecosystems. In the previous company, I was running all of UK and EMEA. We had offices dotted around Europe, and there's a lot of amazing activity. So we're looking at that really closely with the leaders that cover those geographies. And I wouldn't be surprised over time if you see HSBC Innovation Banking expanding there.
So it's a growth story for HSBC Innovation Banking. And looking back at the last few months, do you think this kind of, obviously no one could have foreseen this a year ago with SVB, but going back to what you said at the beginning about merging that kind of entrepreneurial, that nimbleness, that culture of supporting smaller companies with the heft of HSBC, does this set you up for more growth than perhaps under the previous structure? I think so, actually. And I'm pausing because it's, having been with the previous company for almost 20 years, you didn't expect this to happen, but B, didn't expect it to land in such a positive place, if I'm, being honest. But since the Monday post-acquisition, we've been really, really fortunate. And we had a town hall on the Tuesday in March. And one of the messages I gave to my team, and it's more true today than it was even then, is, listen, we had a vision to support innovation businesses across the continent, full transactional banking capabilities, full private banking and wealth capabilities, full investment banking capabilities, everywhere they wanted to go. But it was going to take us like 5 to 7 years to build that out from the ground up in the old SVB UK business. HSBC has all of those capabilities. They have huge depth. So what I said to the team on that Tuesday morning is, we did not expect to get here in this way, but our 2030 strategy just arrived. So there's a lot to be optimistic about. Now, it's going to be continue to be hard work to build out the proposition to make sure it's exactly what our founders and entrepreneurs need at every stage of growth and every subsector. But it is, there's a clear path to building what is, I think, the most unique platform now for innovation businesses in the world. Erin Platts, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City. We will be back next week.
But in the meantime, if you like our show, please head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and rate, review and subscribe.
This episode was hosted by me, David Merritt.
And me, Francine Lacqua.
It was produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andam.
Additional editing by Blake Maples. Special thanks to Aisha Gani, Erin Platts and Sylvia Klimaki.